Hello, welcome to the series of delivering software quality. And now it's the time we have to dive into the testing. We have to write the code for that. So before writing the test, we have to understand the application. This is a Spring Boot application and written or built as a single microservice. It followed the pattern that is defined by a certain school of thoughts, as well as the Spring also provide that we have to write the controller to have the URL mappings, a service class which has the business logic, or your transaction can be managed from the service class. Then a service may call a repository when it want to write to the database, or it can use a proxy which basically enables you to send or to post data to another API or fetch data from another API. So that's how the application is. So this is an example. You can download it from the GitHub. I'll show you shortly. So this is the structure where we have main com and we have ptv.livebox. So ptv is basically the name of the company for which we usually write this piece of code. Livebox is the project or the product or the platform that we are building. And then we have common section with exceptions, controller, DAO layer, DTO, mappers, and services. We will talk about them in step by step. So in GitHub, you can look up my name and you can access. I will post the link in the description as well. So this is one of the repository here, how to build microservices with Spring Boot. You can download it. It has multiple projects in it which talk about different aspects, or the code which contains different aspects. So if we go here in the testing microservices, so here we have covered everything like creating that service. Uh, we we can then test the repository, then we can test the service, we can write the integration test. So that's the repository, and let's download it. So here we have the downloaded version. Here's the sample controller I was talking about. So this controller contains URL mapping. So this is the API, how we'll call it, movies API. And if we want to have the get mapping for the list, if we have to have the ID to find by ID, post mapping, put mapping. So these are the APIs mapping or URL mapping. If we type API slash movies and we hit enter, if this is the get method, so it will land on this method. So here we can see it's basically forwarding the request to the service. So this movie service is injected here. It contains the business logic. So let's jump to the business logic. So it's a very simple one, simple example. So it just find everything from the repository. So repository is the class which basically used to interact with the database. So it will return all the movie entities, right? So once it has returned the movie entity, we just then have to map it to the DTO. Here if we define the entities, you will be able to understand the concept. So these are basically entities. So this is a separate class which contains a table mapping. So TV movies, we have ID, name, and description. So that's the basically class, and this contains all the database mapping. So we cannot return it directly. So we have to map it to the movie object, which is a simple DTO. It's the same, it's more or less the same. In this particular example, entity contains the relationship and everything, whereas movie is just a plain resource type of class which does not contain any mappings. So here the logic is very simple. We find everything we get everything from the database, and then we transform it to the DTO. Here if we look at the example of find by ID, we give it an ID, then it fetches that specific record from the database, and then that entity is again mapped to the DTO object. And if there is an error, so it's it's like we are throwing error if record is not found. So this is the custom exception that we have created and we are throwing it. Similarly on the create, we receive the DTO, we transform it to the entity, and then we set ID to null, and when we persist this, the ORM will automatically populate this field. Once it is persisted, it may populate certain fields, and then we return the DTO by again mapping it. So that's how the simple logic is. So this is the service, whereas the controller has the URL mapping. So controller forward every call to the service, and then service can use the repository to fetch things from the database, and it may use the mapper, which actually transform from DTO to entity and entity to DTO. So that's the application, and that's how the application will look like. Now our plan is to create integration test for the repository, uh, unit test for the service layer, integration test for the service layer, unit test for controller, and integration test for the controller. So these are 5 different types of tests that we will write, and they are targeting different aspect of the application. So see you in the next episode. Thank you. Bye.